So this is episode 2 of my track building series. I'm going to do things a little bit different here. The previous video I was narrating over previous recorded stuff and it didn't really work out how I intended for this, so I kind of changed my setup around so I can do a recording and uh, and talk at the same time, so make my life hopefully a little bit easier and be able to put these together a lot quicker and faster and do a lot less editing in the future. So we're gonna try this out. Hopefully it works out. You might hear a little more ums and ahs and witness a few more brain farts along the way, but uh, in the end, everything should be a lot easier for me in the long run, so I don't have to spend my life putting these things together to help you guys out. But we'll start off here and we'll get going and do a couple different things, a couple different tips and tricks. We're gonna do a couple things here with the cloud compare. I missed this step last week or last video, mainly because the data that I've used in the past has not had it at all, not properly set up. But it's classification. Someone mentioned it in the comments in the previous video, and I figured it'd be worth going over because a lot of the newer data seems to be properly classified. But you can see here we're viewing intensity data, which is what our main focus was last week. But and you saw how I had to smooth out those power lines coming over the track. But if your data is properly classified, it can make your life quite a bit easier. Um, you can see here the ground is blue and the trees are green and roads orange over here. That bridge is kind of reddish orange. And as you pull the filter back here on this little slider here, so it shows the ranges that can be showed. You can see the different colors, how they pop up. And from what I read, 2 is normally ground. So pretty much you filter out anything but 2, you're going to get strictly ground, which is nice. So we're going to come up here, and if you want to go to edit scalar fields, and then we want to do filter by value, or you can come up here and do this little button here. The min max is the same thing. And we want to go 2 and 2, and we want to split it. So let's just turn that off. It's going to show us each um, piece of data, split it out to how we filtered it. So now we're going to switch it back to intensity so we can see it easier, better. And you can see it smooth everything out nice and clean. No more wall, no more grandstands. It's pretty nice. And then you come back over here and you can see this is everything else in the data. A little bit of noise in the ground, and but yeah, all the buildings and stuff. So what I ended up doing is I re-exported everything back into Blender, and I'll show you that in a second. And so everything is a lot easier to lay down your splines and curves and everything because you're not fighting with the walls and everything around you. So I'll show you that in a sec. So here's the data, the ground data only brought in. You can see there's a little bit of a bump where the walls are and the transitions are, but overall it's not too bad compared to having the original cloud in here, which has all the walls at proper height and everything. And also brought into the ground only cloud as well. I don't have the other mesh one in here at this point, but it's still saved in another file. And obviously I still do the smoothing in here, and there is smoothing you can do in Cloud Compare. I've just found it easier to deal with it because I can actually tweak these settings to make it smooth more or less if I need to, depending on how bad the data is. But yeah, that's just one thing I wanted to show with the classifications. If your data has it, there are ways to create classifications. I have not looked into that in depth. I haven't necessarily needed it. I've worked around the issue mainly. But you can use a program called LAS Tools, which is a command line based program, and that can give you the ability to, I guess, filter out and and make classifications if your data does not have it. Again, you may or may not need it. Just something to check to see if your data has it. It could make your life a lot easier. So this is the point that I've gotten the track to before this video compared to the last video. You can see it's got pretty much all the paved areas. I haven't worked on the infield yet. That'll be pretty much the next thing I do as far as this model. But I got the lines all in. I got the most of the walls, the concrete walls in that you would ever come in contact with. So it's pretty much again all the paved areas, and how you build these intersections is really not much different, or how I did it anyway, how than we did with the race surface here. You can see I have the two splines or curves that I made last week, as last episode, as well as the center line, and then I added these extra ones in the middle. And you'll see here, I built this curve, and these are to define the pit concrete areas as well as the turns 3 and 4 concrete areas. Uh, you don't have to do it that way. I just didn't want to. You can come down here and cut these out by hand after the fact. Like this is the original quad mesh, or one of the quad meshes we did, or one of the original meshes we did, and I didn't define it, so I actually went back and redid it because it made more sense. So I would have had to come in here and cut these out by hand, and it just would have been a pain in the butt. But when you do it with curves, it gives you something that you could um, kind of shrink to and align everything up properly, and overall make your life a lot easier in the long run. So but same idea, you just convert these into mesh, fill them in the center, make your base mesh, and then you build your quad mesh and shrink it to that as to the mesh you made, so it's nice and smooth. But yeah, it's just something that it's one way of defining certain areas as you go further away from the track. After this, we'll be doing things a little different to fill this inner part of the land because we're not ever really going to drive on it so much. So that'll be a little bit different process than using the curves and filling them in. But we'll show that in a later episode once I get to that point. So this is a basic technique I like to use on tracks, mainly because you don't really want to have to manually snap all these things uh, to before I started doing what I'm going to show you. I used to have to, if I made any changes, I'd have to, manually connect things together, and it's just you'll go insane connecting all those vertices together, and it's like, oh, there's got to be a better way. Well, there is. So you basically go back, and we use the similar vertex groups like we did in the previous video. Just make a vertex group and assign it, and again, I always like to make sure I got the right ones assigned, and I do. And so we're just going to add a shrink rack modifier. We're going to add the group that we made, and we're going to set it to nearest vertex, and then we're going to pick the object that we want it to go to. This little button here is one I like to check on pretty much all my modifiers. You can see how it shows what it's going to do. I like to see what it is doing. So that's what that does in edit mode. So yeah, so automatically it'll shrink this whole deal into wherever it needs to go. So if you, for example, like if this was like your outside land and you wanted to tweak your layout a little bit, move it a few centimeters or meters away, you don't have to go back and manually, connect everything together again or whatever. You can just simply do that. Define your vertex groups like along like your whole edge of your track, and if anything changes in the inner part or outside part, you can have it shrink, and it'll pretty much always um, it's pretty good. If as the edges get further away, you may have issues because it still has to be going to the closest vertex, but it's just a little trick that I like to use that it could, save you a little bit of time in the long run, especially when you have to make some edits along the way, because a lot of times you have to do things more than once. So now I want to go over a couple of things about curves and kind of best practices, um, certain tips and tricks about setting them up so it makes your life a little easier. Um, uh, you can see here how all my wall objects pretty much, for the most part, have the same origin point. And we're going to kind of go through the process here. Um, Sometimes if I remember to, I'll shrink the cursor to center. So when I create the curve, it'll be at the 0 point. And I do pretty much all my edits at that point in edit mode. That way, when you come out of edit mode, you can scale it all you want in edit mode, and when you come out, it's always going to be 1-to-1 on the scale. Where if you scale in object mode, it's going to change the scale on you, and you'll have to reset it, and it can cause some weird issues along the way. So once you create it, you do pretty much everything you're going to do in edit mode, and that kind of follow is the same kind of deal with most objects. You kind of want to do most of your stuff and tweaks in edit mode and scaling and stuff like that. Um, but you'll see what I also like to do is while I'm setting these up, since they're all kind of going to have the same object on them, I'll just keep it on the same curve, and I'll just duplicate the point and then continue on to the next piece. I'm not going to be precise here because I've already done it. So I jump over to the next section, we'll duplicate, and in in reality, what this isn't going to work well for us if this curve remains one piece. But we're going to break this up into multiple curves, because the way that with Blender works is like if you just have a object follow this, you know, these multiple pieces, it's just going to follow this one section. It's not going to automatically jump over to the next section. So, but anyway, when we're first laying out the curves, I like to keep them as one object. You don't have to. It's not like it's the right or wrong way to do it. It's just a way I've come accustomed to of doing it. And to say most of the time, um, automatic point is fine. Sometimes you may have to change it to, free or whatever you need to do. So yeah, just know that there are different point types. Aligned is just keeps it straight, but it won't automatically change. As soon as you do a rotate or a scale, it changes it to um, uh, aligned mode. So if I went to scale this, you can see it changed it. Now it's in aligned mode. And if you go back to automatic, it changes its color. But it's just some basic things about that. So then, oh, also, every curve is going to default to um, resolution of 12, and just twisting is minimum. We didn't care about these settings when we did the track before, the way we did the track, because they were kind of just used as outlines. We weren't assigning objects to them per se. So, but when we're assigning objects to them, or if you're building a track layout from the center, fantasy layout or a track that you don't really have good data for, and you just want to build it through a center line, which is fine, you're going to want to crank up the resolution. 12 is usually not high resolution enough, and having it up at 64 is not really going to hurt anything. And that's as high as it'll go. But the main thing is twisting. If you leave it on minimum, I found when I was making my first track layout, and I didn't know about this. Bridgehampton was the one that I found out on. So I'd lay out the track and I'd start like doing cambers on certain corners, and then I'd go back to other parts of the track and found that they had like the cambers had changed. Like say I adjusted cambers on turn 2, all of a sudden turn 10 would have cambers. And when you have it on minimum, the whole track or the whole curve can twist a little bit. So you want to come in here and make sure it's on Z up. Uh, and that way, no matter what you do, you can come in here and you can twist individual points, but twisting just one point won't affect any other points. So that's just a key point is every time you create a curve, it's going to be 12 and minimum. So you just want to come in here, kind of make it a practice to just crank it up to 64 and put it on Z up. So we did some basic curves here for our walls, and we want to make an object to shrink it to. You don't want to shrink it to your data because it's got a little bit of noise in it, and it's not necessarily going to line up perfectly with your main track here. So what we want to do here is, what I like to do is duplicate my working track layout, and I'll come in here and I'll do a conversion to mesh. So if there's any modifiers applied to any of these surfaces or objects, it will apply them. So I'll just join it. It's as to one single object, and I'll just call it shrink. There may be already one in the scene. There's already one in the scene, so it's going to make it 001. So now this is a single object. So the reason we do that is when we make, say, like this wall out here, it may shrink to this piece out here. So then, and then this inner piece is going to be on another piece. So it's not going to work because it needs to have an object underneath it. And so if you make that single shrink object, it just gives it one solid object that it can shrink everything to, and it makes your life a little bit easier. So as what we're going to do now is we're going to throw the shrink wrap modifier on there, and we're just going to do the new one I just made. And you can do nearest service point if you want. Um, Nearest service point, depending on how high or low it is compared to the object that you're going to, it can throw some it can mess up the X and the Y a little bit. So sometimes it's using the project version setting and have it on negative, positive, and on the Z axis only. That way it can't mess with your X and the Y. It's only going to move it on the vertical and won't mess with your positioning at all. So a lot of times using this type of shrink wrap is better than nearest service point. You can see here when I change it from nearest service point to project how the whole thing kind of moved a little bit. So that's something that we want to that will make that will, avoid some headaches, especially when need things need to be accurate, like you want your walls to be exactly where they're supposed to be. So coming back to why I left it all single piece. You can see everything is based at 0 point. So we want to break it into multiple pieces. So I just select 1 point of the spline, control and plus sign on the number pad, and that'll pretty much pick every point that's connected to it. And obviously these aren't connected, so it won't pick them. And yeah, so just break it apart as you go. So now you have 4 curves that are all at the 0 point. And why that's important is, well, now I'm gonna show you in the next step. We're gonna make it a basic wall object, and we're gonna assign it, and how you can see how quickly I'll be able to propagate that object to all these curves. So here we're gonna make a basic. We're still snapped to 0. We're gonna make a basic cube, and we're gonna go to edit mode, select all, and we're gonna scale that baby up. And I always just right off the bat like to throw the array modifier on there. So that way you kind of visualized where the array is going to go. And it's almost always going to go on the x-axis of the object. All right, so first things we want to do is get rid of these end faces. We don't need the bottom face. We don't need the front and back faces. Basically, we want to make a C channel. Um, so that's all we want. Don't mind the Alt Shift. That's just how I have it. So why I rotate. Um, but yeah, so that's how. So yeah, so as it goes along, we don't have any faces in the middle that we have to delete later. In the end, we will fill these in once you finish the wall. We'll throw a face on here, but for now, we'll just leave them open while you're doing the initial thing. And you can also do things with end caps. I won't go over that right this second in this video, but maybe at another point when we do some more finishing work. But so yeah, so we want to scale it on the y-axis, make it kind of look like a wall. We'll have to mess with it once we get it in there, but we'll scale it on the z-axis a little bit. So that looks pretty good. So then you can say I did all my edits, scaling's in edit mode, so my scale out here stays the same. Or if you do it in object mode, again, it will mess with that a little bit. So now we want to assign it to a curve, and we're going to pick any one of our curves. So there we are. Got a few too many pieces there. And you can come in here, you can subdivide and move things around. Initially, you just wanted to get it close. We can actually make this a little bit shorter so we get a few more pieces in there like that. Actually, we'll just throw these buttons on so I can see it while it's attached. It just scale to kind of fit the curve as best you can. If it goes over or under, that's fine. You can go back and when we apply the array modifier, you can cut it and make it fit exactly. But right now, we just want to get it roughed in. So we got this object in here. So all we want to do is duplicate it. Come down here to our curve, delete the curve, and put the next one in, and boom, there it is. Right next curve line, ready to go. Duplicate that one, delete the curve, pick the next one, change our count number, and you can use fit to length of the curve, and it will fit it as best it can, but I usually just do it manually. It's fun. And again, we'll duplicate, delete the curve, and we'll pick the next one. And there it is, pretty much assigned. But you'll notice here that it's not following. One thing I forgot to check was this button here. If you don't have this little button checked, it will not, the host object won't follow the modifier that is applied, which is this shrink wrap modifier. So you want to, I'll show you another quick trick here. We're going to select all our curves. Let me just do it up here in the profiler here. And then we're going to select this button. That's going to shrink that up. And then we're going to right click that button and we're going to copy to selected. And that's going to take this setting and apply it to all the other selected objects. And you see all the other walls will shrink it, will follow the curves modifier now. So that was a trick I learned late in the game because I used to go to this, click the button, go to the next one, click the button. So now you just select all your object that you want to have that. So if you want to turn the modifier off on all of them, just turn it off, copy to selected, modifier turns off. So that's a neat little trick. Anyway, so we got that shrunk up to the curves now. So now we want to bring the data in, and here's where you want to shrink it or scale it to fit your data as best you can. So you kind of bring it there. I'm going to scale on the z-axis here. You can see you kind of just go until the points start popping through, so you know you're kind of in the ballpark. So that'll get you kind of roughed in. And I didn't line up the curve very well, but that's your basic way of lining it up. So now obviously I only did one of them. So now I want to just show you a quick thing about multi-user objects. You may have heard about it, you may not know what it's about, but you select all your objects and you go to the host object that you made your changes to. And you do a Control L and you want to link to object data. And when you do that, it's all those other objects are going to follow the host object. So now if you make changes to this, go make crazy high, the other ones are going to follow. You know, anything that you do in edit mode, they'll all snap to it. So if you got all, ARMCO stuff and you have you want to have a center like piece, a single piece, a section of Armco, and you base your whole track on that one piece that's just arrayed around the whole track. If you all of a sudden got to make a change to all of them, and you're like, oh God, I got to change all my walls, all you got to do is make your changes. If you use multi-user objects, you can make your changes to that center object, and it'll propagate to all the rest of the already set up objects on all your curves. So it's just kind of a lifesaver if you utilize that function of multi-user object. There is some issues when you're doing exporting. Sometimes you'll have to convert them back to single user objects, and that's just a matter of having your object selected, press the U key, make single user, and then object and data. So now this is just back to on its own. It has no effect on the rest of the um, objects. The reason it is that the materials sometimes get a little funky. So you can leave things as multi-user as you start exporting things and you start seeing materials that are showing up out of nowhere and it makes no sense. It's probably multi-user objects is enabled somewhere and the exporter for whatever reason doesn't like it. So it's just something to pay attention to. So that's the basics of the wall objects. So what I want to show you now is the lines. And on this particular track, a lot of times on road courses in general, most tracks, the 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 white lines will follow the center line pretty closely. So you can base your line objects off your center line. So similar how you made the road, you just assign it to there, and then just move it on the y-axis to move it in and out of your road, as I say, and that will follow the road pretty much perfectly. In this particular case, the lines do not follow the road outline. You can see out it's very close to the wall on straightaways, and then it gets further away from the walls in the turns. So kind of like sort of follows the racing groove to a degree. So I had to make a custom spline just for the lines here. And I just made the one spline on the outside line. All of these are based on that same spline. pretty much should come into my Google image that I have here. They don't line up perfectly, but I'm not concerned that much about the lines being 100% perfect, as long as they follow the same basic pattern of going in the middle of each other. So I'll just delete these for now so you can see what I did. And it's very simple. You pretty much just duplicate, move along the y-axis, and then move along the x-axis. And then you'll see the lines up there, and then the same thing. We're going to move along y-axis and say all this is still assigned to the curve. I always leave things on the curve as much as possible. And they don't have to be perfect. That's one thing about tracks like these. They're not always perfect. The lines aren't 100% lined up. So doing things by hand sometimes is better than having them everything be perfect, because nothing in the real world is ever perfect. Same thing, similar note is like when you're building the walls, curves and stuff, just, having a little, doing it all by hand will give a little variation in the wall, make everything look a little more natural. But that was just the basics of laying out the line objects in this particular case, where I had to make a specific curve just for the lines. And that's the kind of the case for all this stuff. So when it comes to making the lines for the pit lane here, I'll probably likely be making a curve just for that, or similar to what I did with the outside here. See, the outside wall I didn't make a curve for. All I did was I took the outside edge of the main track here, and similar to what we did with the making the center line in the previous video, I duplicated it, I separated it, and then you can see right now it's an object, so I just converted it to a curve, and then I assigned the wall object to it, and then it was already done. So in a similar case with the pit lines, I could come in here, I could take this edge, obviously those are in there, take this edge and make a curve out of it, and then assign my line, my line object to that. And also one last thing about the lines here, you may wonder how I got this to be a dotted line. It's very simple. The relative offset in the array modifier is what you're concerned with. You can see when we made the wall objects, the relative offset is 1, and that just pretty much butts the objects up to against each other, and there's no gap. But as you increase the relative offset, you'll be creating a gap between the objects, and that's all I did here. If I set this to 1, then you get one, continuous line, connected together. But if you add the offset to it, then the separation starts coming in. So yeah, so that's the basics of, get dotted lines or whatever. Some people make dotted lines with alpha channels and stuff. I'm not a huge fan of that. I usually like to make, the individual objects. Also, there's sometimes these lines need to be have a little curve to them. So having straight line is less than ideal, so you could just add some subdivisions to it, so that way they will follow the track a little bit instead of just being straight, because usually when they paint the lines, they're driving, in a straight line, around the track, so it's going to follow the curve of the track. They're not going to be perfectly straight, because they're not going to drive straight and then straight. So having it like that, and then you could then come in here, since I added the subdivision to that, I could come in here and make that link the object data, and then now all of these objects, if I show all edges, are now, do the little trick here to copy to select this, and now they all have that subdivision. So again, another case where multi-user objects are handy. Um, so that's again, little I try to include these little tips along the way. Maybe feel a little jumbled as I do it, but as they come up in my head, I'm like, oh, this is a good thing to know. I'll just stop and try to fit it in. So try to include as many tips as I can to make life overall easier, because again, a lot of this stuff is very confusing and can get really out of control as far as overwhelming when you're trying to get into this stuff. So knowing these little tricks ahead of time, and if you're going through this video, note them down. They may help you in the long run. So one last tip here. that I want to show you before we end this at this particular episode is a little tool that I used, and actually one of the tools that I was resistant to moving to 2.8 because it hadn't been moved over yet. But as of yesterday, I found out it is moved over, so that's another um, reason I'll be moving over to 2.8 soon. But so we're gonna put this into wired mode, and we're gonna throw the intensity data in. So we wanted the, in this particular case, I want to cut out this area for pit lane. So basically, I like to use just the knife tool. This is a regular blender tool, it's nothing special. You just roughly trace out the profile of what you need to do. You can see it's a bunch of straight lines. You could, it's going to be very hard to make it nice and smooth. So this particular tool that I use, and there's a bunch of features in this tool, but I mainly use the curve stretch tool, and the main name of the tool is Mirror Tools, and again, there is a version of it for 2.8. But it's just a handy little tool that you go back to 2 points. You can turn this into a perfectly straight line, and or in this particular case, I'm going to be using 3 points, and it'll smooth it out for me nice and clean. And then again, if I needed to tweak it, I could come in here and move this around. Um, and then also you can obviously add more points if you wanted to follow it more. But I usually like to do the 3 points because it makes everything nice and smooth because it just adds that 1 point in the middle. So that's just a little nice little tool that I like to use to make to find edges like that. So that'd be pretty much it for this episode. This pretty much covers just some basic modeling techniques of, say, building a wall material, wall object, doing the curves, different techniques with the curves. The next episode, I'm going to do some basics going into the UV maps and assigning materials and to see what we're looking at here with these materials, with the concrete on the pit lane and the UV maps for the road. It's a couple different ways, and I'll try to cover most of them. So hopefully I'm actually going to try to do episode 3 now and start recording that. So hopefully I'll be able to get these 2 episodes out within a pretty close period of time. But so leave comments if this is a better setup, if I'm rambling too much, if you need to be more coherent or make a better script. I'm still trying to figure this out. I just make kind of notes as I or am building the track of things that I think could be important. If you need me, if you think maybe I should go into more detail on certain things, I say if any feedback's good. Um, it could to kind of make these maybe make them a little bit easier to understand. As I say, I'm gonna I'll watch these back or listen to these back, and hopefully everything kind of makes sense and I don't kind of just ramble on forever like I am right now. So this will be it for this video, and look out for the next one, mainly for UV maps.